Welcome to my channel.
Chow, the reign over Lochdub, was not merely falling, it was engaged in a dedicated, vertical assault on the landscape. It was a grey, relentless Highland drubbing that turned the mountains into indistinct bruises against the sky and made the waters of the loch look as inviting as cold gravy. Inside the police station, which smelled faintly of damp wool and coal dust, Police Constable Hamish Macbeth was engaged in his primary occupational hazard, avoiding occupation. He was a tall, gangly man whose uniform always seemed a size too large, hanging off his lanky frame in a way that suggested it had given up hope of ever looking official. His flaming red hair was currently losing a battle against gravity and the humidity, and his hazel eyes were fixed with intense concentration on a spider weaving a web in the corner of the ceiling above the lukewarm radiator. The telephone on his desk was ringing. It had been ringing for 5 minutes. Hamish knew who it was. It was Strathbane Police Headquarters. Specifically, it would be Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man whose blood pressure was permanently situated in the red zone, and who viewed Hamish as a sort of evolutionary throwback, a carbuncle on the backside of modern policing. Blair wanted statistics. He wanted reports on sheep-dipping regulations. He wanted to know why Hamish hadn't arrested anyone for 3 weeks. Hamish let it ring. He had more pressing concerns. His stomach gave a demanding rumble. He had run out of coffee, the real stuff, not the powdered dust the force supplied, and his small electric stove was currently acting as a makeshift heater for his feet. Beside the stove, his small, nondescript mongrel, Lugs, let out a heavy sigh that perfectly matched his master's mood, keeping one eye open just in case food suddenly materialized out of the damp air. "It's no use, Lugs," Hamish muttered, swinging his feet off the desk. "Blair will burst a vein if I don't answer, and then we'll have the paperwork of a fatality on our hands." He reached for the phone just as it stopped ringing. He smiled beatifically, a victory for inertia. He decided that the silence required a celebration involving a bacon roll and a proper pot of coffee up at the Tommel Castle Hotel. He shrugged on his heavy police greatcoat, adjusted his peaked cap to a rakish, unprofessional angle, and stepped out into the deluge. Lugs, sensing an outing that might involve scraps, trotted gloomily at his heels. The village of Lochdub was hunkered down. The few hardy souls braving the weather moved with the efficient scurries of people who knew exactly how miserable it was outside. Smoke curled from stone chimneys, snatched away instantly by the gusting wind. Hamish was halfway along the waterfront road, head down against the gale, when the sound reached him. It wasn't the usual rattle of a farmer's Land Rover or the sensible hum of the doctor's Volvo. It was a high-pitched, aggressive whine, like an angry dentist's drill approaching at speed. A low-slung sports car, painted a shade of Italian crimson so bright it seemed to sear the grey retina of the day, tore around the bend. It was a vehicle designed for the sun-drenched cornices of the Amalfi Coast, not a single track road in Sutherland covered in sheep dung and puddles the size of small lochs. As it passed Hamish, the driver, a blur of expensive sunglasses and pale hair, didn't bother to slow down. A tsunami of dirty peaty water erupted from beneath the low-profile tires, drenching the tall policeman from his knees to his cap. Hamish stopped. He slowly wiped a streak of mud from his cheek. Lugs shook himself violently, sending a secondary shower over his master's boots. "Right," Hamish said softly to the retreating red taillights. "That's you off my Christmas card list." The car skidded to a halt on the gravel driveway of the Tommel Castle Hotel, narrowly missing a rhododendron bush. Hamish continued his slow, loping walk toward the hotel. He wasn't going to run. Running suggested enthusiasm, and Hamish Macbeth rationed enthusiasm for things like fresh venison or a particularly comfortable chair. By the time he pushed open the heavy oak door of the hotel, the newcomer was already making his presence felt in the reception lobby. He was a man perhaps in his late 40s, dressed in clothes that were aggressively casual in an extremely expensive way, designer jeans that looked artfully distressed, a cashmere sweater the color of expensive cream, and a leather jacket that probably cost more than Hamish earned in 6 months. He had the kind of silvery blonde hair that required expensive maintenance, and his tan was too uniform to have come from the actual sun. He was currently leaning over the reception desk, speaking to Mr. Johnson, the hotel manager, in a voice that was loud, nasal, and carried the unmistakable vowels of the wealthy English home counties. It was the voice of a Sassenach used to getting his own way. "Kay and I specifically requested a room with a view of the loch, not the car park," the man was saying, tapping a platinum credit card on the mahogany counter. "And this damp, does it always smell like wet dog in here?" Hamish, Dricking quietly onto the Persian runner rug just behind him, cleared his throat. That might be me, you're smelling, sir, or my actual dog. The man spun around. He looked Hamish up and down, taking in the muddy trousers, the soaked greatcoat, and the general air of rural dishevelment. His lip curled slightly. He clearly didn't see a police officer, he saw a piece of local fauna that hadn't been properly domesticated. Oh, the local constabulary, I presume, the man said. He didn't offer a hand. Look at the state of you. Don't you have standards up here? We have weather up here, Hamish said mildly, removing his cap and shaking the water off it, narrowly missing the man's suede shoes, and potholes, which you might have noticed when you baptized me back down the road. The man waved a dismissive hand. Yes, well, roads are barbaric. I am Jasper Vance. Perhaps you've heard of me? Vance Aesthetics? The London clinics? Can't say I have, Hamish lied. He had seen the man's face in a glossy magazine. Priscilla Halberton Smythe had left lying around. Something about revolutionary anti-aging treatments that involved things Hamish preferred not to think about. Well, I'm here to buy property, Jasper Vance announced to the lobby at large. I intend to bring a bit of civilization to this dreary little corner. A holistic retreat. High-end clientele. It will put this place on the map. Mr. Johnson, a man whose face usually wore a mask of professional blandness, looked as if he had just swallowed a lemon. Lochdub liked being off the map. Being on the map usually meant tourists demanding cappuccinos and complaining about the midges. That sounds grand, Hamish said, his voice flat. Just grand. It will be magnificent, Vance corrected. He turned back to Mr. Johnson. Now, chop chop. My bags are in the Ferrari, and do try to find me a decent bottle of claret. None of that supermarket swill. Hamish watched as the porter was summoned to deal with the Sassenach's luggage. He noticed Vance didn't say thank you. Hamish walked into the cozy hotel bar, where a fire was crackling cheerily in the hearth. He ordered a large coffee and a bacon roll from Archie, the barman. Who's the peacock in the lobby? Archie asked in a low voice, as the coffee machine hissed. Trouble, Hamish said, sinking into a worn leather armchair near the fire. Lugs immediately curled up on the hearth rug, steaming gently. Imported, expensive trouble. Hamish took a sip of the hot coffee and felt the chill leave his bones. He hated outsiders coming in and stirring things up. They brought money, yes, but they also brought impatience, noise, and a total lack of understanding of the Highland way of life. They looked at the mountains and saw scenery. Hamish looked at them and saw home, and the best places to hide if Blair was on the warpath. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind howl outside, and the high-pitched complaining of Jasper Vance echoing from the lobby. Hamish just wanted a quiet life. But as he chewed his bacon roll, a distinct, uncomfortable feeling settled in his gut. It wasn't indigestion. It was the deep, ancestral instinct of a Highlander knowing that peace, once shattered by such a loud noise, was very hard to put back together. Why, Hamish was just considering the merits of a second bacon roll strictly for medicinal purposes to combat the damp. He told himself when the peaceful clink of Archie's glassware was shattered by a sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. It was a scream, high-pitched and jagged, tearing through the muffled hum of the hotel lobby like a rusty saw through silk. Och, for the love of, Hamish sighed, setting his mug down with a heavy thud. He looked at Lugs, who had also lifted his head, ears twitching in the direction of the kitchens. There goes the peace. Lugs. There goes the quiet afternoon. He stood up, his joints protesting with a few dry creaks, and loped back into the lobby. The scene was one of panicked confusion. Jessie, the young and perennially startled chambermaid, was standing by the heavy side doors that led to the hotel's ornamental gardens, her face the color of skimmed milk, and her hand clamped over her mouth. Mr. Johnson was hurrying toward her, his professional composure beginning to fray at the edges. He's in the water, Jessie wailed, pointing a shaking finger toward the garden. He's in the fountain, and he's not moving. Hamish pushed past them, his movements surprisingly fluid for a man who claimed to find walking an ordeal. He stepped out into the biting wind. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, but the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. There, in the center of the hotel's Highland Heritage Fountain, a centerpiece Jasper Vance had only moments ago mocked for its lack of sophistication, lay the man himself. Jasper Vance was face down in the shallow, moss-covered basin. The expensive Italian sports car was still idling nearby, its headlights cutting twin golden paths through the gloom, but its owner was currently being baptized in a way he hadn't intended. The cream-colored cashmere sweater was now a sodden, muddy rag, and his designer jeans were snagged on the stone beak of a decorative eagle. Hamish waded into the freezing water, his boots filling instantly with a cold squelch. He reached down and turned the body over. Vance's eyes were wide, staring blankly at the grey Highland sky with an expression of profound surprise, as if death were a social faux pas. He hadn't expected to encounter so far north. There was a dark, purplish bruise at the base of his skull, and his tongue was protruding slightly, caught between his teeth. "Dead," Hamish muttered, the words snatched away by a gust of wind. He looked down at the man who had been so full of noise and arrogance only 10 minutes prior. Lug stood at the edge of the fountain, sniffing the air tentatively, and let out a low, mournful howl. Hamish didn't move for a long moment. He didn't pull out a radio or start shouting orders. Instead, he stood in the knee-deep water, his hands deep in his greatcoat pockets, his eyes scanning the gravel path, the dripping rhododendrons, and the windows of the hotel overlooking the garden. He noticed the way the gravel had been kicked up near the fountain's edge, not the frantic scuffle of a struggle, but a single deep gouge, as if someone had planted their foot firmly to deliver a shove. He saw a small, bright object snagged in the moss near Vance's ear, a tiny, gold-plated cap from an expensive fountain pen. "Sir, is he all right?" Mr. Johnson's voice drifted from the doorway, thin and trembling. "She's as all right as a man can be, with a broken neck and a lung full of lotched-up water," Hamish called back, his voice deceptively casual. He stepped out of the fountain, his wet trousers clinging to his legs. "You'd best call the station in Strathbane, Mr. Johnson, and tell them to send the surgeon. But you might want to warn them to bring their macintoshes. It's going to be a long night." Hamish pulled a crumpled handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his hands, his mind already working behind the mask of his weary rural face. This wasn't an accident. A man doesn't just trip into a fountain and break his neck unless the fountain has help. He looked back at the hotel, seeing the shadows of guests and staff watching from the windows. Somewhere among the lace curtains and the peat smoke, someone was feeling very relieved. He knew what was coming next. The piece of the village was dead, buried under the weight of the investigation that would inevitably follow. And even worse than the murder was the certainty of who would be leading that investigation. Hamish could already hear the phantom echo of a police siren, and the very real threat of a certain red-faced DC-wah screaming about his incompetence. The wail of sirens eventually cut through the mist, a jarring mechanical shriek that sent a flock of crows wheeling into the grey sky from the pines behind the hotel. 2 white and blue patrol cars from Strathbane skidded into the gravel driveway, followed closely by a black unmarked saloon that looked entirely too clean for the Highlands. Out of the saloon stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He was a man who looked as though he had been carved out of a particularly irritable turnip. With a face that remained a permanent shade of bruised purple and a neck that seemed to have been swallowed by his collar, he stomped toward the fountain, his city shoes instantly surrendering to the mud, which only served to deepen the scowl etched into his features. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice bouncing off the stone walls of the hotel. "You total, utter, blithering liability. I leave you alone for 5 minutes in this godforsaken puddle of a village, and you manage to let a multimillionaire drown in a birdbath." Hamish, who was currently wringing out the hem of his greatcoat, looked up with an expression of blank, bovine helpfulness. "It's a fountain, sir. Though I suppose a very large bird might enjoy it. And he didn't just drown. He's got a bit of a bump on his head. I don't need your medical expertise, you lanky streak of Highland misery." Blair shoved past Hamish, nearly knocking him back into the water. He stared down at the body of Jasper Vance with a mixture of professional greed and personal annoyance. "Vance, the aesthetics man. This is going to be all over the tabloids. My face will be on every screen from here to London." He paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the wet, bedraggled PC. "And I'm not letting you ruin my promotion by tripping over your own feet. Get out of the way. Anderson. MC Lean. Get the tape up. Move these peasants back." Detectives Anderson and MC Lean, Blair's usual shadows, began roughly herding the hotel staff back toward the entrance. Blair, meanwhile, began pacing around the fountain, his heavy footsteps obliterating the gouge in the gravel Hamish had noted earlier. "Accident," Blair announced loudly, though the forensic team hadn't even unpacked their bags. "Slipped, hit his head, drowned. Clearly drunk on that overpriced swill they serve here. Case closed by dinner time." "He didn't smell of drink, sir," Hamish said softly, his hands tucked back into his pockets, and his car was still running. "It's a bit odd to leave a Ferrari idling just to go for a quick splash in the moss." Blair turned on him, his face darkening to a dangerous shade of plum. "Are you telling me how to do my job, Macbeth? You, a man who couldn't find a cow in a telephone booth?" If I say it's an accident until I decide it's a murder. And if it is a murder, I'll find the killer while you're still trying to figure out which end of the whistle to blow. Blair's gaze swept over the crowd of shivering staff and landed on a young man standing near the kitchen's Geordie, the local handyman, who was clutching a pair of heavy garden shears and looking particularly guilty by virtue of being naturally nervous. "You there?" Blair pointed a thick finger. "Handyman, aren't you? See, you were near the gardens. Jealous of his car, were you? Or did he complain about your shoddy work?" I was just pruning the roses, sir," Geordie stammered, his knees beginning to shake. "Pruning the roses in a downpour." "Likely story," Blair sneered, turning back to his detectives. "Take him inside. I want him sweated. Macbeth, you stay here. Try not to fall into the loch. If you move so much as a pebble before the photographers are done, I'll have you directing traffic in Glasgow by Monday." Hamish watched as Blair stormed into the hotel, his chest puffed out like a bantam rooster. She knew Geordie hadn't killed anyone. The boy was terrified of his own shadow, let alone a man like Vance. But arguing with Blair was like trying to teach a pig to sing. It wasted your time and annoyed the pig. Instead, Hamish whistled low for lugs. He had no intention of staying by the fountain. Blair wanted the credit, and Blair wanted the limelight, which suited Hamish just fine. While the DCI was busy shouting at an innocent man in the dining room, there was a whole village full of people who had seen Jasper Vance arrive. And more importantly, seen who had been waiting for him. "Come on, lugs," Hamish whispered, turning his back on the crime scene and heading toward the side gate. "Let's go see if the postmistress has put the kettle on. I have a feeling Mrs. Kennedy has heard more than just the rain today." Hamish loped down the gravel path, his wet boots making a rhythmic slap-squelch sound that seemed to mock Blair's distant, muffled shouting. The heavy gates of the Tommel Castle Hotel swung shut behind him, and for a moment, the only sound was the sigh of the wind through the rowan trees. Lugs trotted alongside, his tail a sodden plume of defiance against the weather. To any observer, Hamish Macbeth looked like a man defeated, a lowly constable sent packing by his superiors. In reality, Hamish was moving with the purposeful lethargy of a stalking cat. Blair would spend the next 3 hours examining fingerprints that would belong to half the hotel staff and trying to make a terrified handyman confess to a crime he lacked the imagination to commit. Meanwhile, the real story of Jasper Vance was not in the fountain. It was in the ledgers, the whispers, and the discarded envelopes of lockdub. She reached the village post office, a small stone building that served as the nervous system of the community. Inside, it smelled of old paper, floor wax, and Mrs. Kennedy's peppermint tea. Mrs. Kennedy was behind the counter, her spectacles perched so far down her nose they seemed to be holding onto her nostrils for dear life. She was currently sorting a stack of mail with the clinical efficiency of a card sharp. "Och, Hamish," she said without looking up. "I heard the sirens. Has someone finally driven off the pier, or is it just the usual Saturday madness at the hotel?" "A bit more permanent than a dip in the loch, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish replied, leaning casually against the counter. He took off his cap and began to wring it out over a nearby wastepaper basket. "That fancy fellow in the red car, Mr. Vance. He's gone and got himself dead in the fountain." Mrs. Kennedy paused, a postcard from Inverness hovering in mid-air. "Dead? Well, I can't say the heavens are weeping for him, even if the clouds are. He was a nasty piece of work, that one. Came in here yesterday demanding I open a private box for him and complaining about the speed of the post, as if the mail vans can fly over the glens. A private box." Hamish's ears perked up. "Did he now? And did he receive anything in it today?" "He did. A thick envelope, hand-addressed, no return address, but it had a London postmark. He looked like he had swallowed a wasp when he opened it right there by the door. Then he marched out without so much as a thank you." Hamish tilted his head, his hazel eyes clouded with thought. "Did he say anything else, Mrs. Kennedy? Any mention of why a man with a multi-million-pound clinic in London would want to open a holistic retreat in a place where the most holistic thing we have is a bowl of porridge?" Mrs. Kennedy sniffed, finally setting the postcard down. "He said he was looking for the woman who stole his future. His words, Hamish, not mine. Very dramatic. I thought at the time he had been watching too many of those London soap operas. He was asking after the newcomers. Wanted to know who had moved into the old Macrae cottage up on the Bree." Hamish felt a cold prickle that had nothing to do with his wet trousers. The Macrae cottage had been rented recently by a woman who called herself Mrs. Smith, a name as useful as a chocolate teapot for identification. She was quiet, kept to herself, and spent her days painting the lock in watercolors that were surprisingly dark and turbulent. Well, that's a fine bit of gossip to chew on, Hamish said, reaching into a jar on the counter and helping himself to a ginger nut biscuit. I don't suppose there's any tea left in that pot. Help yourself. You're mooching great heap, Mrs. Kennedy grumbled, though her eyes softened. She liked Hamish, mostly because he never gave her a ticket for her husband's erratic parking. Hamish poured a cup of the dark, stewed tea and leaned back, letting the warmth seep into his bones. He was thinking about the gold-plated pen cap he had seen in the fountain. Jasper Vance didn't look like a man who wrote his own notes, he looked like a man who shouted orders at people who wrote notes for him. If the pen cap was his, why was it in the fountain? And if it wasn't his, whose was it? He finished the tea in 3 long gulps, nodded his thanks, and stepped back out into the rain. He made his way to the Spice of the North, Lochdub's solitary and surprisingly excellent curry shop. Mr. Patel was polishing the front window, his face a picture of stoic resignation against the Scottish weather. A bad day for the tourists, Constable, Patel remarked as Hamish entered. And a worse day for the residents, Hamish replied. Did you serve Mr. Vance last night? The man with the tan and the temper. Patel's expression soured. I did. He sent the lamb korma back 3 times. Said it wasn't authentic. Then he had a very loud argument on his mobile phone. He was shouting about a silent partner who was trying to bleed him dry. He mentioned a name Smythe. No, something like it. He said if they didn't meet him at the hotel gardens today, he'd go to the papers with the whole sordid story of the 2012 scandal. Hamish nodded, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift, though they didn't yet fit. A silent partner, a stolen future, and a woman in a cottage. It was a recipe for murder far more potent than anything Blair was cooking up in the hotel dining room. He thanked Mr. Patel and walked back into the center of the village. The rain was beginning to turn into a thick, clinging mist that swallowed the tops of the mountains. He could see the lights of the hotel in the distance, a fortress of suspicion. He knew he should head back, but the mention of a name like Smythe made him uneasy. It was a common enough name among the gentry, but in Lochdub, it carried a specific weight. He began to walk toward the waterfront, his mind racing. Vance had been an outsider, a man who thought he could buy his way into the Highlands and impose his will on the landscape, but the Highlands had a way of resisting. Curbed the noise and the arrogance, and then they struck back with a quiet, devastating finality. As he reached the harbour, he saw the local minister, Mr. Wellington, struggling with a heavy wooden crate near the pier. Need a hand, Minister, Hamish called out. Ah, Hamish, the very man, Wellington panted. Have you heard the news? A tragedy at the hotel. A man drowned, a stranger, they say. Aye, a stranger, Hamish said, taking one side of the crate. Did you happen to see him yesterday? He was making quite a splash, even before he hit the fountain. I saw him, Wellington said darkly. He was at the churchyard, looking at the headstones, specifically, the headstones of the Macrae family. I asked if I could help him, and he told me to mind my own business. A very rude man, Hamish. Not the sort we want in Lochdub. Hamish set the crate down, his heart thudding. The Macrae family, the cottage, the woman. The threads were tightening. He needed to talk to someone who understood the social layers of the upper class, someone who could tell him about London scandals and silent partners. He needed Priscilla. Just as the thought formed, the sleek silver shape of her car appeared through the mist, pulling up beside him with the quiet confidence of old money. The window slid down, and the cool, elegant face of Priscilla Halberton Smythe looked out at him. You look like a drowned rat, Hamish, she said, her voice a soothing balm after the day's chaos. And I hear you have a corpse in a fountain. Would you like a lift, or are you planning on swimming the rest of the way home? Hamish climbed in, the scent of leather and expensive perfume filling his senses, knowing that the real investigation was only just beginning in the quiet, rain-slicked streets of his home. She closed the door, shutting out the biting wind, and felt the first true spark of a lead ignite in his mind. He watched the wipers sweep away the droplets on the windshield, each stroke a metronome for his mounting suspicions. Tell me, Priscilla, he said softly, staring at the grey horizon, what do you know about a woman called Mrs. Smith? The car pulled away, leaving the harbour behind as the mystery deepened into the dark Highland night. It was finally time for some real answers. The Silver Rover's windshield wipers performed a rhythmic, hypnotic dance, sweeping away the heavy Highland tears that blurred the world outside. Inside, the car was a sanctuary of climate-controlled perfection, smelling of expensive Italian leather and a hint of the lily of the valley, perfume that Priscilla Halberton Smythe had worn for as long as Hamish could remember. Hamish sat in the passenger seat, acutely aware of the muddy puddle forming on the pristine floor mat beneath his boots, and the damp, sheep-like aroma rising from his woolen greatcoat. He felt like a stray dog that had been momentarily allowed onto the sofa, a sensation only amplified by Priscilla's cool, effortless elegance. She drove with a casual confidence, her gloved hands light on the wheel as she navigated the treacherous, rain-slicked bends of the coastal road. Hamish looked at her profile, silhouetted against the encroaching grey twilight, and felt the familiar, dull ache of a man who knew he was pining for a world he could never truly inhabit. "Mrs. Smith," Priscilla repeated, her voice a calm contrast to the howling wind battering the car's exterior. "The name itself is a provocation, isn't it, Hamish? It's the sort of alias one chooses when they simply cannot be bothered to lie convincingly. Think I can shed some light on your mysterious artist at the Macrae cottage? I saw her a fortnight ago, when I was dropping off some old linens for the church fete. She has the look of a woman who has been hollowed out by something. There is a certain carriage to the shoulders, a way of holding the head, that suggests she once commanded a great deal of respect. You don't see that often in people who choose to live in a drafty cottage at the edge of the world." Hamish leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes for a second. "And Jasper Vance, did your circles overlap with his, Priscilla?" He seemed to think he was the vanguard of civilization, bringing aesthetics to the savages. Priscilla's lip curled in a way that was almost, but not quite, unladylike. "Jasper Vance was a tradesman, Hamish. A very wealthy one, admittedly, but a tradesman nonetheless. He sold vanity to people who had more money than sense. However, even in London, his reputation was brittle. There was a tremendous scandal back in 2012 involving his primary clinic in Chelsea. It was all over the glossies for months. A botched surgical procedure on a young girl, the daughter of a duke, no less, left her with permanent nerve damage and a face that no amount of aesthetics could ever truly repair. The lead surgeon at the time was a woman named Sylvia Thorne. She was a rising star, brilliant and formidable. But after that disaster, Vance made sure she took the entirety of the blame. She was struck off the medical register, her assets were liquidated in the ensuing civil suits, and she effectively ceased to exist in the eyes of society. Vance, meanwhile, used his insurance and a battery of lawyers to pivot the clinic's branding, and came out of the mess twice as rich as before. Sylvia Thorne, Hamish mused, the name clicking into place like the bolt of a rifle. A woman who lost her future, her career, and her name. And now we have a Mrs. Smith who paints angry, turbulent landscapes and hides in Lochdub. If Vance came here to build a retreat, he wasn't just bringing business. He was bringing the ghost of her past right to her front door. It's a long way from a Chelsea clinic to a stone cottage, but apparently, it wasn't far enough to outrun a man like that. Priscilla glanced at him, her blue eyes sharp and discerning. If that woman is Sylvia Thorne, Hamish, she didn't just lose a job, she lost her life's work. A surgeon's hands are her identity. To be reduced to painting watercolors in a shed, that is a special kind of purgatory. And you must consider the silent partner your friend Mr. Patel mentioned. The name he heard. Smythe, it likely wasn't me, though God knows my father has made enough bad investments. But there was a man named Smeaton who acted as Vance's financier during the 2012 restructuring. A man known for being as ruthless as he is invisible. If Smeaton found out Vance was planning to go rogue with a new retreat up here, he wouldn't have been happy about the loss of control. The car slowed as the lights of the Lochdub police station appeared through the mist. The sight of DC Vi's car, parked aggressively across two spaces, made Hamish's stomach tighten. He didn't want to leave the warmth of the Rover. He wanted to stay in this bubble of luxury, where the problems were abstract, and the air didn't smell of wet wool and impending disaster. He looked at Priscilla, wanting to say something profound, something that might bridge the vast social chasm between a village constable and the daughter of a laird. "Thank you, Priscilla," he said instead, his voice sounding small even to his own ears. "You've given me more to work with than 3 hours of Blair's shouting." "Do be careful, Hamish," Priscilla said, her tone softening just a fraction. Vance was a man who traded in surfaces. When you start scratching at the surface of a man like that, you often find something very ugly underneath. And Sylvia Thornier Missy Smith is a woman who has already seen the worst the world has to offer. People like that don't fear the police, and they certainly don't fear the law. They only understand consequences. Hamish nodded, opened the door, and stepped out into the biting Highland wind. The cold hit him like a physical blow, instantly soaking through his trousers. He watched as Priscilla's car pulled away, its red taillights fading into the grey soup of the evening like twin embers. He felt a familiar sense of displacement, a man caught between the village he loved and the woman he could never quite reach. But as he turned toward the station, the information Priscilla had provided began to settle into a cold, hard certainty. He had a victim who was a predator, a suspect who was a victim, and a hidden partner who might be the most dangerous of them all. He adjusted his cap, squared his shoulders, and prepared to face the wrath of DC the Thirse. He would play the fool, he would take the insults, and he would let them think he was as slow as the Highland winter. But as he stepped through the door, Hamish Macbeth knew exactly where he was going next. He was going to have a very quiet, very careful look at the paintings in the Macrae cottage. Police station in Lochstub was never intended for high drama. It was originally designed for the slow recording of stolen sheep, the occasional drunk and disorderly after a ceilidh, and the endless filing of firearm certificates that Hamish habitually ignored. As he stepped through the door, the air was thick with the scent of cheap, acrid cigar smoke and the metallic tang of an overtaxed radiator. DC Furs was leaning over the duty desk, his face a triumphant shade of magenta that suggested he was moments away from either a promotion or a stroke. Beside him, Detective Anderson was tapping a rhythmic, annoying beat on a clipboard, while the sound of muffled, rhythmic sobbing drifted from the small interview room at the back. Hamish hung his wet greatcoat on the peg, moving with the deliberate slowness of a man who hoped to remain invisible. But Blair's eyes, small and predatory, like those of a cornered weasel, snapped toward him instantly. "Well, look what the damp cat dragged in," Blair sneered, his voice wet with condescension. "Our local hero, back from his wee stroll while the real policemen do the work. I hope the rain didn't ruin your complexion, Macbeth, because I've got something here that's going to make you look even more useless than usual. We found the killer, and we didn't need any of your local intuition to do it." Hamish sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to deflate his lanky frame further. He walked to the kettle, rattling it to see if there was enough water for a brew. "Is that so, sir? And would this killer be young Geordie from the gardens, then? The boy who cries when he accidentally treads on a beetle?" Blair let out a sharp, barking laugh and slammed a heavy, clear evidence bag down onto the counter. Inside lay a gleaming, gold-plated fountain pen, its clip shaped like a stylized V. "We found this in the pocket of the boy's work tunic. It's a custom-made piece from Vance's own clinic, worth £500 if it's worth a penny." The lad was caught red-handed with the spoils of his crime. He obviously tried to rob the Sassenach. The man resisted, and Geordie gave him a shove into the fountain. Simple, effective, and I'll be back in Strathbane by 10 o'clock with a confession in my pocket. He's already cracking. Another 10 minutes of MC Lean's persuasion, and hell sign anything we put in front of him. Hamish didn't look at the pen immediately. He looked instead through the glass partition of the interview room. Geordie was huddled in a chair, his face buried in his hands. His fingers were stained a deep, indelible black-green, the sticky, resinous sap of the rhododendron bushes he had been pruning all morning. It was a substance that required turpentine and a wire brush to remove, a fact Hamish knew well from his own occasional bouts of gardening. Hamish then turned his gaze to the evidence bag. The gold pen was pristine. There wasn't a smudge of green resin on the polished barrel, no sticky residue on the cap, and no trace of the garden grime that covered every inch of Geordie's person. Even the clip was untarnished, reflecting the harsh fluorescent light of the station with a mocking brilliance. "It's a very clean pen, sir," Hamish remarked mildly, scratching the back of his neck. "Especially for being in the pocket of a boy who's been elbow-deep in hedge grease since 6 this morning." Blair's eyes narrowed, his brow furrowing into a series of fleshy ridges. "What are you prattling on about now, Macbeth? It's a gold pen. Gold doesn't get dirty." Hamish pointed a long, calloused finger at the bag. "It's not the gold I'm worried about, sir. It's the lack of everything else. If Geordie had taken that pen from a dying man's pocket, or even picked it up off the gravel, it would be covered in that green sap from his hands. Look at the boy's fingers. He's been handling rhododendrons. That sap is like tar. But that pen looks like it's just come out of a jeweller's velvet box. And there's another thing." Hamish reached into his own pocket and pulled out the small, cracked pen cap he had retrieved from the fountain. Earlier the one Blair's team had missed in their rush to find a scapegoat. He placed it on the counter next to the evidence bag. The cap in the bag was perfect. The cap Hamish held was identical in design, but it had a distinct, jagged hairline fracture near the base, and it was dull with the film of stagnant fountain water. "Chance didn't have one pen, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur. "He had a set, or someone else had the twin. The cap I found was in the water with the body. The pen you found was planted in Geordie's shed, or his pocket after the fact. Someone wanted us to find it. Someone who knew exactly who the easiest target in the village would be. Blair stared at the two caps, the purple hue of his face slowly fading to a dull, mottled grey. For a moment, the heavy silence of the station was broken only by the sound of the rain against the window. Blair hated being wrong, but more than that, he hated looking foolish in front of his subordinates. He snatched the evidence bag off the counter, his knuckles white. This proves nothing. Maybe he wiped it, or maybe he has a spare pair of gloves. But the conviction was gone from his voice. He looked at Anderson, who was suddenly very interested in his own shoelaces. Hamish leaned against the desk, his expression one of polite, vacant concern. Of course, sir. You're likely right. But if I were a big city detective like yourself, I'd be wondering why the real killer went to so much trouble to frame a boy who can barely tie his own laces. It suggests they're still here, doesn't it? Watching us. Waiting for the stupid police to haul the wrong man away so they can make their clean escape. Blair let out a long, hissed breath, his chest heaving. Fine! MC Lean, let the boy go. But tell him if he leaves the village, I'll have him in irons. Macbeth, if this leads to a dead end, I'll have your badge for breakfast. Now get out of my sight and find me something better than a cracked piece of plastic. Hamish nodded obediently, catching Geordie's eye through the glass as the boy was led out, shaking and pale. He had bought the boy time, but the red herring had served its purpose for the killer. It had kept the police busy while the trail grew cold. As Hamish stepped back out into the night, Lugs waiting faithfully by the door, he knew the hidden motive wasn't about the money Vance was worth now. It was about the lives he had ruined a decade ago. It was time to pay a visit to the woman who painted the storms. The climb up the Bree toward the Macquarie cottage was a steep, lung-burning ascent that Hamish usually avoided, unless there was the promise of a particularly fine malt at the end of it. The rain had settled into a persistent, fine mist, the kind of Highland weather that doesn't just make you wet, but seems to seep into your very bones and memories. Lugs trotted ahead, his paws making soft, rhythmic thuds on the peaty soil, occasionally pausing to shake the silver droplets from his coat. As the village of Lochstub shrank below them, the lights of the Tommel Castle Hotel looked like fallen stars caught in a muddy net. Hamish adjusted his cap, feeling the weight of the cracked pen cap in his pocket. He wasn't thinking about DCI Blair's looming deadline or the threat of a transfer to the grey, concrete jungles of the south. Instead, he was thinking about the way Jasper Vance had died not in a struggle of titans, but with a clumsy, humiliating shove into a decorative birdbath. It lacked the grandeur of a professional hit. It felt like a burst of sudden, petty temper. The cottage itself was a low-slung building of local stone, its thatch long since replaced by sensible slate that gleamed like a wet seal's back in the gloom. A single yellow light burned in the window, casting a long, trembling finger across the heather. As Hamish approached, the scent of wood smoke was joined by something sharper and more chemically unmistakable, oily tang of turpentine and linseed oil. He knocked on the heavy oak door, the sound swallowed instantly by the vast, empty silence of the hillside. After a moment, the door creaked open just enough to reveal a sliver of a woman's face. She was younger than the Mrs. Smith the village gossip had suggested, perhaps in her early 40s. With hair the colour of wood ash and eyes that looked as though they hadn't seen a full night's sleep since the turn of the decade. "Constable Macbeth," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I imagine you're here about the noise at the hotel. News travels fast when the wind is behind it." "It does that, Mom," Hamish replied, offering a weary, non-threatening smile that had disarmed many a hardened poacher. "And I was wondering if a cold, damp policeman might find a corner to dry his feet, and perhaps a drop of tea. The hotel is a bit crowded with detectives at the moment, and I've always found the air up here more conducive to clear thinking." The woman hesitated, her gaze flicking to Lugs, who gave a pathetic, shivering whimper on cue. With a sigh that spoke of long-suffering resignation, she stepped back and gestured for him to enter. The interior of the cottage was a startling contrast to its rugged exterior. Canvases were stacked 3 deep against every wall, depicting the loch in various states of violent, expressionist agonies, deep indigos, and jagged streaks of white that looked more like scars than waves. In the center of the room stood an easel, and on the small table beside it, a collection of brushes were laid out with a precision that bordered on the clinical. "You're a fine painter, Mrs. Smith," Hamish said, wandering over to the table. He didn't look at the art, he looked at the tools. He noticed a small, leather-bound case of instruments that looked more like scalpels than palette knives. Or should I say Dr. Thorne? It's a terrible thing, losing a career over a bit of bad luck and a man like Jasper Vance. He was a man who liked to keep his own hands clean while pointing the finger at everyone else. The woman froze. A teapot halfway to a chipped mug. The silence in the room became heavy, thick with the ghosts of the London life she had fled. "He found me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He came here not to apologize, but to gloat. He wanted me to know that even here, in this God-forsaken rain, he could still reach out and touch me. He wanted to buy this land, Hamish. He wanted to build his retreat right over this cottage, just to prove he could erase me a second time. He called it cleaning up the landscape." Hamish accepted the tea, the warmth of the mug a welcome relief. He watched her hands as she sat down. They were beautiful, slender hands, but as she reached for her own cup, he noticed the subtle, telltale tremorth reason she could no longer operate. The physical manifestation of the 2012 disaster. He was a cruel man, Hamish agreed softly, but he wasn't a brave one. And a man like that usually makes more than one enemy. You see, the funny thing about that fountain pen Blair found is that it was far too clean. It was a plant. And the person who planted it knew exactly how to play on a policeman's prejudices. She took a slow sip of the tea, leaning back in the worn armchair. "Tell me about the silent partner Vance was shouting about at the curry shop. A man who felt Vance was becoming a liability. Because you see, Sylvia, I don't think you killed him. You have the motive, and the anger. But you also have a surgeon's soul. If you were going to kill a man who ruined your life, you wouldn't leave him face down in a puddle like a discarded cigar. You'd want him to see it coming. You'd want it to be precise." Sylvia Thorne looked at him, a flicker of something like respect crossing her weary features. "He mentioned a man named Smeaton. But Smeaton isn't just a partner, he's a collector of reputations. He didn't care about the retreat. He cared about the fact that Vance was planning to marry into the Halberton Smythe circle to gain social standing. It was a petty, social climbing move that would have exposed Smeaton's financial offshore accounts to a new level of scrutiny. Vance was being killed not for his sins, but for his ambitions." Hamish nodded, the hidden motive finally crystallizing. It wasn't about the grand tragedy of a ruined medical career. It was about the small, grubby reality of a social climber threatening a criminal's anonymity. The villain wasn't a ghost from the past, but someone very much in the present, someone who had been helping the investigation while steering it toward the most convenient victim. Hamish stood up, his mind already leaping toward the trap he needed to set. He looked at the painting on the easel, dark, brooding depiction of the Tommel Castle fountain. He was a man who forgot that in the Highlands, the water is always deeper than it looks, Hamish said, putting on his cap. "Thank you for the tea, Sylvia. I think it's time I went back down to the village and had a word with someone who's been far too helpful for their own good." As he stepped out into the mist, he knew the real killer was likely enjoying a celebratory whiskey at the hotel bar, confident that the useless local constable was still chasing shadows in the rain. But Hamish Macbeth was no longer chasing shadows, he was following the very real scent of a man who thought he was smarter than the mountains. Hamish loped back down the rain-slicked hillside, the gravity of the descent doing most of the work for his tired legs. The mist had thickened, turning the familiar contours of the village into a ghostly, shifting landscape where every stone wall and gnarled rowan tree looked like a lurking figure. Lugg stayed close, his tail tucked low, occasionally letting out a soft huff of disapproval at the dampness. Hamish was not heading for the warmth of his own hearth, nor was he returning to the police station to endure another round of DC Thurs, purple-faced theatrics. He was heading for the Tommel Castle Hotel, specifically the public bar, which served as the unofficial headquarters for both the village's gossip and its most expensive alcohol. He needed an audience, and more importantly, he needed a specific pair of ears to catch a very carefully crafted lie. The bar was nearly empty, save for a few residents who were nursing drams with the solemnity of mourners, and a small, nondescript man sitting in a shadowed booth near the fireplace. This was Mr. Pringle, the man who had appeared in Lockdub alongside the Sirens, claiming to be Jasper Vance's private secretary and logistics coordinator. Throughout the afternoon, Pringle had been the picture of the helpful subordinate, providing Blair with Vance's itinerary, his contacts, and most crucially the suggestion that the local handyman had been acting erratically near the Ferrari. He was a man of beige sweaters and quiet voices, the kind of person who could vanish into a crowd of three. Hamish slumped onto a bar stool with a theatrical groan, his wet greatcoat sighing as it hit the wood. "Archie," he wheezed, rubbing his face with a calloused hand. "A pint of the dark, if you please. And don't bother with a glass for the dog, hell, just have a saucer of water and a bit of that stale pork pie if you've got any left." Archie, the barman, slid a foaming pint across the counter, his eyes searching Hamish's face for a sign of what was really happening. You look like you've been dragged through a hedge backward, Hamish. Is the great London detective still screaming at the wallpaper? Oh, Blair's found his man, or so he thinks, Hamish said, raising his voice just enough to ensure it reached the shadowed booth. But I've just come from the McCrae cottage. It seems the lady there found something the Strathbane lads missed in their hurry to get back to the hotel's central heating. A second gold fountain pen, Archie, identical to the one they found in Geordie's pocket. But this one isn't empty. There's a tiny roll of microfilm or some such nonsense tucked into the barrel. Sylvia Missy's. Smith, that is, says it looks like a list of account numbers. Seems Vance was keeping a digital leash on his silent partners. Blackmail material, I shouldn't wonder. Pringle didn't move, but the scratch of his pen against a notepad suddenly stopped. Hamish took a long, slow draught of his beer, watching the man's reflection in the mirror behind the bar. The problem is, Hamish continued, wiping foam from his lip, I'm too exhausted to deal with it tonight. I've left it tucked inside the old wooden tackle box in the boathouse at the bottom of the garden. I figured no one would look for a fortune in a box of rusty fish hooks. I'll collect it in the morning when the forensics team arrives from Glasgow. They'll have the proper gadgets to read it. If it's what I think it is, someone's going to be very unhappy by lunchtime tomorrow. The boathouse. Archie frowned. Isn't that the one with the rotten floorboards and the ghost of the old piper? The very same, Hamish nodded. It's a miserable place, dark as a coal cellar and smells like a dead seal. No one in their right mind would go near it on a night like this, which makes it the perfect safe. He finished his pint in one go and stood up, swaying slightly, as if from a combination of fatigue and alcohol. Come on, Lugs. Let's go find a bed. I'm done with murders and mysteries for one day. Let the Glasgow boys handle the heavy lifting tomorrow. As Hamish walked out of the bar, he didn't look back at Pringle. He didn't need to. He knew the type. Pringle was a man of order and efficiency, a man who had spent his life cleaning up the messy edges of Jasper Vance's greed, a man who would never allow a list of accounts to fall into the hands of the Glasgow police. Hamish stepped out into the night, but he didn't head for his station. He circled around the back of the hotel, moving through the dripping rhododendrons with the silence of a poacher. He made his way toward the old boathouse, a rickety structure that sat on stilts over the black, lapping waters of the loch. The rain had picked up again, a cold, stinging lash that drummed on the tin roof of the boathouse. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of creosote and rotting timber. Hamish didn't turn on his torch. He moved by touch, finding a sturdy beam to lean against in the deepest corner of the shed. Lugs settled down at his feet, his wet fur pressing against Hamish's leg for warmth. Now we wait, Lugs, Hamish whispered into the darkness. We wait for the man who is far too helpful. We wait for the man who thinks a Highland constable is just a bit of local scenery with a badge. He felt the cold seeping through his boots, but his mind was sharp, focused on the sound of the wind and the rhythmic slap of the water against the pilings. He knew the trap was set. He had played the part of the lazy, indiscreet fool to perfection. He had given the killer a location, a motive, and a sense of urgency. In the distance, he heard the faint crunch of Gravella light, purposeful footstep that didn't belong to a villager or a clumsy policeman from Strathbane. Someone was coming. Someone who thought they were walking into an empty shed to retrieve a secret, but who was actually walking into the end of their tether. Hamish gripped his heavy wooden truncheon, his heart settling into a slow, steady rhythm. The Highlands had a way of bringing out the truth, eventually. It just required a bit of patience, a bit of silence, and the right kind of bait. The footsteps grew closer, hesitating at the door. The hinges gave a long, rusted shriek as someone pushed their way inside. A thin beam of a pocket torch cut through the gloom, dancing over the piles of netting and the old, overturned rowboat. Hamish held his breath, blending into the shadows as the light searched for the tackle box. This was the moment where the lazy policeman would show just how much he had been paying attention, while everyone else was shouting. This was the moment the trap would spring. He watched as the figure moved deeper into the boathouse, unaware that the real danger wasn't the evidence, but the tall, gangly man waiting in the dark corner. Hamish tightened his grip, ready to end the charade. The flashlight beam flickered over the rusted scales of a long dead fish. Mr. Pringle, the man of beige sweaters and quiet, efficient shadows, was no longer the picture of professional calm. His breathing was heavy and jagged, a rhythmic, desperate sound that competed with the incessant, mournful slap of the loch against the rotting wooden pilings. He reached the far corner of the boathouse where the old wooden tackle box sat, perched precariously atop a stack of discarded, brine-soaked nets. To Pringle, that box was a lifeline, the object standing between his freedom and the cold, unyielding reach of the Strathbane authorities, or worse, the silent, lethal reach of his employer, the elusive Mr. Smeaton. To Hamish Macbeth, watching from the velvet darkness of the rafters, it was merely a container of rusty lures and tangled line that hadn't seen the flash of a trout since the mid-80s. Pringle's gloved hands fumbled with the rusted metal latch. The iron gave a sharp, agonizing protest, a screech of aged metal that seemed to echo across the water like the cry of a banshee. He threw the lid back with a violent jerk, his torch beam diving inside, frantically searching for the gold barrel and the non-existent microfilm that he believed would finally end his career. "It's mostly lures in there, Mr. Pringle," Hamish said, his voice a low, melodic Highland rumble that emerged from the very shadows. "Though I believe there is a particularly fine blue charm buried at the bottom if you are planning on doing a bit of night fishing. Though the season is officially closed, as a man of your nature would know." Pringle spun around with a gasp, the torch beam wildly slashing through the thick darkness until it found Hamish's face. The tall, lanky constable didn't look particularly like a threat. He was leaning casually against a support beam, his long arms crossed over his chest, looking more like a man waiting for a delayed bus than a policeman who had just cornered a calculated killer. But his eyes were different now. The lazy expression had vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity that made Pringle's blood run colder than the Highland rain outside. "Macbeth," Pringle hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "You're supposed to be in bed. You're supposed to be the simple village idiot who lets the grown-ups from the city handle the difficult mess. I get that a lot, actually," Hamish admitted, pushing himself off the beam with a slow, purposeful grace. "It is a very useful thing, being thought the idiot. People tell you things, they leave things behind. Like that gold pen cap I found in the garden fountain. You were so very careful to plant the second pen on poor Geordie, but you forgot that a man like Jasper Vance was a man of complete sets. He didn't just have a pen, he had a pair, and he was holding one of them when you gave him that shove. It snapped off and stayed in the water, while the rest of the pen stayed in your hand. You must have panicked when you realized you were holding half the evidence. So you thought you would be clever and use it to frame the most helpless boy in the village." Pringle's hand went to the pocket of his damp raincoat. It was not a slow movement. He pulled out a small, snub-nosed revolver, the dark, cold metal gleaming dully in the reflected light of his own dropped torch. "I am not going back," Pringle said, his face twisting into a mask of desperate, frantic fury. "Vance was a fool. He was going to expose every one of our accounts just for a chance to sit at the table with the Halbert and Smythes. Smeaton told me to handle it. It was supposed to be a heart attack, a quiet and professional exit, but the man would not stop shouting. He would not stop insulting my work. I just gave him a push. That is all it was, Macbeth. A simple push. A push that kills a man is still murder in these parts, Mr. Pringle," Hamish said softly. He didn't wait for the man to aim the weapon. With a suddenness that defied his gawky frame, Hamish lunged. He didn't move like a trained commando, he moved like a Highland deer hunter, fast, silent, and with a surprising, sinewy power. He caught Pringle's wrist just as the first shot rang out, the sound deafening in the cramped, echoing space of the boathouse. The bullet went wide, splintering a piece of the overturned rowboat and sending a shower of wood shards into the air. Lugs, usually quiet, turned into a snarling blur of fur and teeth, snapping ferociously at Pringle's ankles. Two men crashed into the stack of nets, the rotten floorboards beneath them groaning under the sudden weight of the struggle. Pringle was a small man, but he fought with the frantic, wiry strength of a cornered rat. He bit, he scratched, and he tried desperately to bring the gun around for a second shot. Hamish grunted as a sharp elbow caught him squarely in the ribs, but he did not let go. He used his superior height, pinning Pringle against the rough, cold stone wall of the boathouse foundation. With a sharp, practiced twist of the wrist, he forced the revolver from Pringle's grip. It clattered loudly onto the floor and slid through a wide gap in the boards, disappearing into the black, lapping water of the loch below with a final, mocking splash. "That's quite enough of that," Hamish panted, his face inches from Pringle's terrified eyes. "You have made enough of a mess for one day, and I am afraid I am all out of patience." Pringle let out a broken sob, his resistance collapsing as quickly as it had begun. He slumped in Hamish's grip, the fight drained out of him by final defeat. Hamish stood in the semi-darkness of the boathouse, his chest heaving with the exertion of the struggle. The silence that followed the gunshot and the subsequent splash of the revolver into the loch was heavy, broken only by the whimpering of Mr. Pringle and the rhythmic, satisfied panting of Lugs. The small man was a crumpled heap against the stone foundation, his spirit seemingly broken the moment his weapon had vanished into the depths. Hamish reached into a pile of discarded maritime clutter and pulled out a length of thick, orange nylon baling twine. With the practiced ease of a man who had tied up many a stray sheep, he began to secure Pringle's wrists behind his back. The knots were firm, professional, and utterly devoid of sympathy. "You shouldn't have fired that shot, Mr. Pringle," Hamish said, his voice returning to its usual, deceptive Highland drawl. "The loch has a way of carrying sound, and I imagine the whole of Lochstub is currently wondering who is out duck hunting in the middle of a gale. It's a very noisy way to try and keep a secret." Pringle didn't look up. His glasses were skewed, and a thin trickle of blood from a scraped cheek was beginning to mingle with the rainwater on his face. "It doesn't matter," he whispered, his voice cracking with the onset of shock. "Vance was a dead man the moment he decided to blackmail Smeaton. I was just the instrument. Smeaton doesn't leave loose ends, Macbeth. If I hadn't pushed him, I would have been the one in that fountain. You don't understand the scale of it. The London clinics, the offshore accounts, the reputations of men far more powerful than a country policeman. It was all a house of cards, and Vance was starting to pull at the bottom." Hamish finished the knots and stood up, dusting off his trousers. He looked down at the man who had traded his soul for a secretary's salary and a few scraps of power. It was a story as old as the mountain's greed, fear, and the inevitable collapse of a life built on surfaces. But as Hamish looked at his prisoner, a cold, familiar dread began to settle in his own stomach. It was not the fear of Smeaton or the threat of a London syndicate. It was the realization that he had just solved a high-profile, sensational murder case. He had caught a professional killer red-handed, survived a shooting, and uncovered a major financial conspiracy involving some of the wealthiest men in the country, the top brass in Strathbane. This wouldn't just be a job well done, it would be a ticket to a promotion. They would want to move him to a city precinct, perhaps Glasgow, or even Edinburgh. They would want him in a suit, sitting in a windowless office, filling out endless forms and navigating the treacherous politics of a metropolitan police force. He would lose his station, his loch, and the quiet, slow-paced life that was the only thing he truly valued. The hero of Lochstub would be rewarded with a life he would absolutely loathe. "Och, lugs," Hamish muttered, scratching the dog behind a damp ear. "We've gone and done it now. We've been too clever for our own good." He looked at the radio on his belt. He had to call it in. The detectives would be here in minutes, and then the media would follow. He needed a way out. He needed to be the useless peasant once again. His hazel eyes moved from the cowering Pringle to the door of the boathouse, and a plan began to form, a plan as subtle and winding as a Highland deer path. He reached for his radio, but he didn't call for backup in his own name. Instead, he adjusted the frequency and cleared his throat, adopting a tone of panicked, fumbling incompetence. "Base, this is PC Macbeth," he stammered into the receiver. I think I've found something. I followed DCI Blair's brilliant suggestion about the boathouse, and it seems he was absolutely right. The suspect is here, just as the inspector predicted. I've somehow managed to stumble over him. Please tell DCI Blair that his tactical genius has paid off, and I'm just holding the fort until he can arrive to take charge of the scene. I'm quite out of my depth here. Over. 10 minutes later, the peace of the waterfront was shattered by the arrival of 3 police vehicles, their blue lights strobing against the mist like a frantic disco. DCI Blair was the first out of the lead car, his face a vibrant, pulsing shade of violet. He stormed into the boathouse, his heavy boots clattering on the boards, followed by a wearer-looking Anderson and MC Lean. He stopped dead when he saw Hamish leaning against the wall, looking entirely bewildered, and Pringle tied up on the floor with the evidence scattered around him. "Macbeth," Blair roared, though there was a hint of confusion beneath the rage. "What is the meaning of this? Why are you in my crime scene?" "Oh, thank goodness you're here, sir," Hamish said, his voice thick with a fake, breathless relief. "I was just doing as you told me earlier. You said to watch the areas Vance had mocked, and you were quite right, the boathouse was the key. Your theory about the secretary being the silent partner's shadow was a stroke of genius. I just happened to be here when he showed up to burn the evidence. I barely managed to keep him here until you arrived. I've just been following your lead, sir. I'm just glad I didn't mess up your carefully laid trap." Blair blinked. He looked at Pringle, then at the list of accounts, which was actually just a laundry list Hamish had found in the tackle box, and then at the shivering PC. The gears of Blair's vanity began to turn, slowly at first, then with the greased speed of a man who loved a headline. He puffed out his chest, his double chin wobbling with newfound pride. "Well, yes, Naturally, Blair blustered, adjusting his tie. I knew the secretary was the weak link. It was a standard tactical squeeze, Macbeth. Phew, I'm glad you were able to follow orders for once. Anderson, get the cuffs on him. MC Lean, secure that evidence. This is a massive win for the Strathbane CID. I'll be giving the press conference myself. Hamish watched as they hauled Pringle away. Blair was already practicing his tough detective look for the cameras, completely ignoring the lanky constable who had actually done the work. I'll mention your name in the report, Macbeth, Blair called out over his shoulder as he headed for the door. Something about administrative assistance. Don't expect a medal. I would not dream of it, sir, Hamish replied with a humble nod. I'm just happy to be of use to such a fine investigator. As the cars peeled away, Hamish stood alone in the dark boathouse. He had successfully shifted the credit, protected his anonymity, and ensured that Blair would be the one stuck with the long, grueling months of court appearances and paperwork. The threat of promotion had vanished, like the mist over the loch. He was still just the lazy PC of Lochdub, and to Hamish Macbeth, that was the greatest victory of all. He whistled for lugs, stepped out into the rain, and began the long walk home to his quiet stove and his pot of coffee. The village was safe, the outsider was gone, and most importantly, Hamish was exactly where he wanted to be. He looked at the stars beginning to peek through the clouds, and smiled. It had been a very productive day of doing absolutely nothing, in the eyes of the law. He reached into his pocket, felt the cold air, and realized he still had a bit of bacon roll left. He shared it with Lugs, the two of them moving like shadows through the sleeping Highland night. The walk back from the boathouse was a solitary victory march, though to any observer peering through the darkened windows of the Tommel Castle Hotel, it would have appeared as the shuffling retreat of a thoroughly defeated man. The rain had finally surrendered, leaving behind a world that was dripping, hushed, and smelling of ancient peat and fresh pine. Lugs trotted ahead, his tail a steady, rhythmic pendulum that signaled his quiet approval of the night's conclusion. Hamish Macbeth did not hurry. He never hurried when the work was done. He watched the moonlight struggle to pierce the thinning clouds, casting silver, splintered reflections onto the surface of the loch. The mystery of the Sassenach in the fountain was over. Jasper Vance, the man who wanted to buy the future, was gone. Pringle, the man who wanted to bury the past, was in a cold cell in Strathbane. And Sylvia Thorne, the woman who had been destroyed by both, was finally, perhaps, just a little bit safer. Hamish felt a familiar weight lifting from his shoulders, the heavy, unwelcome weight of being a clever policeman. For the next few hours, until the sun climbed over the store, he could just be a man who lived in a small stone house by the sea. By the time he reached the police station, the first hint of a pale, watery dawn was beginning to bleed into the eastern sky. He moved quietly through the kitchen, the linoleum cold beneath his boots. He did not turn on the main lights, preferring the soft, orange glow of the embers in the peat stove. He set a pot of water to boil, the sound of the rising steam a comforting domestic hiss that drowned out the lingering echoes of the gunshot in the boathouse. She fed Lugs a double portion of tinned meat as a reward for his bravery against the secretary, then sat at the small wooden table with a thick mug of coffee. He stared at the wall, his mind replaying the events. He had been lucky. If Pringle had been a better shot, or if Blair had been a smarter man, Hamish's life in Lochdub would be over. He would be a detective inspector in some grey, concrete city, wearing a tie and worrying about quotas. He took a long, slow sip of the bitter coffee and smiled. He had played the fool to perfection, and in doing so, he had saved his soul for another season. The following morning, the village of Lochdub was a hive of controlled hysteria. The news of the international blackmail ring and the brilliant arrest by Strathbane C. the T was splashed across every television screen and newspaper in the Highlands. Hamish sat in the bar of the hotel, nursing a small glass of ginger beer and watching the midday news. On the screen, DC4's standing in front of the fountain, his chest puffed out so far he looked like he might topple over. He was wearing a new, expensive-looking suit and was speaking to a cluster of microphones with the gravity of a man who had just single-handedly saved the monarchy. It was a matter of classic forensic deduction, Blair was saying, his voice booming through the quiet bar. I identified the suspect's psychological profile early on and lured him to the boathouse where my team and I were waiting. It was a textbook operation. Hamish watched with an expression of blank, bovine admiration. Beside him, Archie the barman let out a snort of derision. Textbook operation, my foot, Archie muttered. The man was probably hiding in the car until you were finished with the work, Hamish. QC. You shouldn't say such things, Archie, Hamish said mildly, his eyes never leaving the screen. The inspector is a very brave man. He has a lot of medals, I'm sure. I'm just glad he was there to tell me where to stand. I would have been lost without his tactical guidance. Archie looked at Hamish, his eyes narrowing. He had known Hamish for years, and he knew that the more humble the constable sounded, the more he was hiding. But he said nothing. In Lochdub, people knew how to keep a secret, especially when that secret kept their favourite policeman from being transferred to the south. The door to the bar swung open, and Priscilla Halberton Smythe walked in, looking as cool and elegant as a winter morning. She didn't go to the bar, she walked straight to Hamish's booth and sat down. She looked at the television, then back at Hamish's muddy boots. "I see the tactical genius is taking his bows," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And I see you've managed to escape without a single scratch on your reputation for being entirely useless. You're a very wicked man, Hamish Macbeth." "I don't know what you mean, Priscilla," Hamish replied, though a small spark of mischief danced in his hazel eyes. "I'm just a simple village constable. The inspector said so himself in his report. He called my contribution satisfactorily administrative. I think that means I made the tea correctly." Priscilla laughed, a soft, musical sound that made Hamish's heart do a small, uncomfortable flip. She reached across the table and touched his hand for a brief, fleeting second. "You're a fraud, Hamish, but you're our fraud. Sylvia Thorne left this morning, by the way. She asked me to give you this." She handed him a small, wrapped canvas. Hamish opened it carefully. It was a painting of the loch at dawn, but the colours were not violent or dark. They were soft, hopeful blues and golds. In the corner, there was a tiny, red-haired figure walking a dog along the shore. "She's going back to London," Priscilla continued. "She's going to fight to get her licence back. She said you reminded her that some things are worth the struggle, even if the weather is against you. She also said to tell you that the pen is mightier than the sword, but a Highland constable is mightier than both." Hamish looked at the painting, feeling a strange lump in his throat. He wrapped it back up and tucked it under his arm. "She was a fine lady," he said simply. "I hope she finds what she's looking for." As Priscilla left, Hamish stood up and whistled for lugs. He had a long walk ahead of him. He had to check on a reported theft of a prize-winning turnip in the next glen. And then he had a very important appointment with a pot of mutton stew that had been simmering on his stove since breakfast. The outsiders were gone, the noise had faded, and the village had returned to its natural, slow rhythm. The mountains were still there, the loch was still deep, and DC farce, Blair was safely tucked away in a television studio far, far away. Hamish stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, feeling the familiar chill of the Highland wind on his face. He adjusted his cap to its usual rakish angle and began the long, easy trek back to his station. He had no medals, no promotions, and no headlines to his name, but as he looked out over the water, Hamish Macbeth knew he was the richest man in Scotland. He had his home, he had his dog, and he had his peace. And in the Highlands, that was more than enough for any man. She walked on, a lanky shadow against the ancient stone, disappearing into the mist as the day began to fade into a quiet, perfect evening. The frost had finally descended upon Lochdub, a sharp, crystalline silence that felt far more honest than the deceitful Highland rain. It was a cold that bit at the ears and turned one's breath into drifting ghosts, but inside the small police station, the air was thick with the scent of simmering mutton, barley, and the rich, earthy aroma of a fresh pot of coffee. Hamish Macbeth sat in his favourite sagging armchair, his long legs stretched out toward the glowing embers of the peat stove, where the heat was a solid, comforting weight against his shins. Lugs was sprawled across his feet, twitching in his sleep as he chased phantom rabbits through the heather of his dreams. On the table beside them lay the morning's edition of the Strathbane Sentinel, its front page dominated by a photograph of DC Vars Blair, looking remarkably like a well-fed toad in a tailored suit. The headline, "Sutherland's Finest Crushes Blackmail Empire," was a masterpiece of hyperbole that Hamish had read 3 times with a sense of profound, quiet satisfaction. To the world, Blair was a hero of modern detection. To Hamish, Blair was a very useful shield that kept the prying eyes of the chief constable away from the quiet shores of the loch. There was a sharp, rhythmic rapping at the door, and before Hamish could even begin the long process of sighing and standing up, Mrs. Kennedy marched in. She was wrapped in a coat of thick, sensible tweed and was carrying a basket that smelled enticingly of fresh scones. She stopped in the middle of the room, her eyes darting from the bubbling pot of stew to the newspaper, and finally to the lanky, dishevelled man in the armchair. "Still at it, I see, Hamish Macbeth," she said, her voice a sharp crack in the warm silence. "Avoiding the king's work while the rest of the world is up and doing." I hear they're giving that Blair man a commendation in Inverness next week. A crying shame, I call it. When everyone in this village knows who really went out into that boathouse while the Strathbane police were busy worrying about their dry cleaning. Hamish offered her a slow, sleepy smile and gestured toward the second chair. Now, Mrs. Kennedy, you shouldn't be listening to village gossip. The inspector is a very busy man with a lot of heavy responsibilities. I'm sure he earned every bit of that medal. I'm just a humble constable, and I'm quite happy to let the great men have their day in the sun while I stay here in the shade. Would you like a drop of coffee? It's the real stuff. Priscilla brought it over from the hotel. Mrs. Kennedy sniffed, but she sat down anyway, unloading her scones onto a chipped plate. Humble, my foot. You're as humble as a fox in a henhouse, Hamish, but I suppose we should be grateful. If you had taken the credit, they would have moved you to some city where they don't know the difference between a Highland ewe and a street lamp. And then, who would we have to ignore our parking tickets? Geordie came by the post office this morning, by the way. He's back at the hotel, though he says hell never look at a fountain again without getting the shivers. He wanted me to give you these. She reached into her basket and pulled out half a dozen brown eggs, still warm from the nest. A thank you, he said, for believing a boy when the world was calling him a thief. Hamish accepted the eggs with a nod of genuine gratitude. In the Highlands, eggs and scones were a far more valuable currency than medals or headlines. They represented a community that looked after its own, a place where the truth was understood, even if it was never officially recorded. As Mrs. Kennedy rattled on about the minister's gout and the scandalous price of wool, Hamish felt the last of the tension from the Vance case evaporate. The outsider had come, he had stirred the waters, and he had been absorbed by the landscape, leaving nothing behind but a lingering story for the locals to chew on over their winter drams. The Sassenach had wanted to put Lochdub on the map, never realizing that the people who lived there preferred to remain invisible to the rest of the world. After Mrs. Kennedy had finished her coffee and departed, leaving the room feeling slightly emptier and much noisier, Hamish returned to his seat. He picked up the small canvas Sylvia Thorne had given him and propped it up on the mantelpiece, right next to a dusty photograph of his parents. The painting of the loch at dawn seemed to radiate a quiet light of its own, a reminder that out of the darkness and the mud of the fountain, something beautiful had been salvaged. Sylvia was gone, back to a world of sterile theatres and high-stakes surgery. But she had left a part of her soul behind in the blue and gold strokes of the brush. Hamish wondered if she would ever truly find peace in the city, or if she would spend the rest of her life dreaming of the rain-slicked mountains of Sutherland. The telephone on his desk gave a sudden, shrill ring, cutting through the domestic peace of the station. Hamish looked at it for a long moment, his hand hovering over the receiver. It would be Blair, no doubt, wanting a report on some triviality, or shouting about a misplaced form, or it might be headquarters, asking why he hadn't filed his weekly mileage. He looked at Luggs, who opened one eye and let out a soft, dismissive huff. Hamish smiled and leaned back, letting the phone ring. He had a pot of mutton stew that was reaching its peak of perfection, a fresh scone with butter, and a fire that was finally throwing out a decent heat. The world could wait. The crimes of the future were still over the horizon, and the crimes of the past were buried in the black waters of the loch. He was Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, the laziest, most incompetent, and most overlooked officer in the Scottish Highlands, and he had never been happier in his life. He took a bite of the scone, felt the warmth of the stove on his shins, and listened to the wind beginning to howl once more around the eaves of the station. Let the ambitious men chase their ghosts in the city. Hamish had everything he needed right here. As the telephone finally gave up its persistent calling and fell silent, the only sound left was the crackle of the peat and the steady, quiet breathing of a man who was exactly where he belonged. The Highlands had won again, and for now, all was right with the world.